In today's read aloud, we're going to hear about some of the differences in the southern economy and the northern economy. The word economy describes a system by which people produce or make goods or items to trade or to sell with others who want those goods. When people trade, buy, or sell goods with one another, they're cooperating. Because of this cooperation, people get resources such as food, clothing, and shelter, and that they need, that they might otherwise not be able to produce or make themselves. When more and more people engage in trading, buying, and selling of goods, we say the economy is strong. Remember, Harriet Tubman worked on a tobacco plantation in the South. Plantations were an important part of the Southern economy. How the people in the South supported themselves and earned money to buy things they needed. The Southern economy depended on the farmers and the plantation owners to produce certain crops that other people wanted to buy. To produce these crops, Southern plantation owners treated people from Africa unfairly by forcing them to work in slavery and making them work on their plantations for no money. Even though it was not their choice, enslaved Africans contributed valuable labor and skills to the success of the plantations. It was wrong of the plantation owners to treat enslaved Africans poorly just because they thought the African people were different from them. The community that developed among the enslaved Africans helped them survive because they relied on and helped each other. The next read aloud you are about to hear is called Controversy over Slavery. Controversy is an argument or a disagreement that happens when people have differing opinions. Today we are going to listen about how many enslaved Africans worked on large plantations in the southern states and that they tried to escape to the northern states where slavery was not allowed. Carefully listen to today's read aloud to learn more about the North and the South and how their ways of life and their economies were different, and why this caused such controversy over slavery. Let's go back to the year 1850, when Harriet Tubman escaped from a life of slavery in the South by running away to Pennsylvania, a northern state where slavery was not allowed. To divide the North and South on a map of the United States, it is easiest if you use what is known as the Mason-Dixon line. The Mason-Dixon line is an imaginary line between the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland. It was named after two Englishmen, Charles Mason and Jebediah Dixon, who surveyed this land almost 100 years earlier. The Mason-Dixon line became an imaginary line between the North and the South. Slavery was allowed in the South, below the Mason-Dixon line, but slavery was not allowed in the North, above the Mason-Dixon line. What were the major differences between the states in the North and the states in the South? Slavery was the most obvious difference between the North and the South, but it was not the only difference. The South relied completely on agriculture, or farming, for its economy. The farmland and the weather provided the right growing conditions for certain crops that grew well in the South, such as cotton, sugar, and tobacco. Most farms in the South were small and with very few enslaved Africans, or even none at all. But there were enormous plantations like the ones where Harriet Tubman was enslaved, where the plantation owners who grew these crops forced hundreds of enslaved Africans to work day after day under horrible conditions for no wages at all. On these plantations, enslaved Africans worked together, helping each other so their lives would be a little less hard. The crops grown on these plantations were bought by people of the North as far as Great Britain. That helped the Southern economy grow. North had farms too, but they were different from the large Southern plantations. Some farmers in the North grew corn, wheat, as well as other fruits and vegetables. Some Northern farmers also had livestock like cattle, sheep, and pigs. But the North did not have the right weather to grow crops that were grown in the South. crops like cotton, sugar, and tobacco. People in the North could buy these crops from farmers in the South. So, farmers in the North grew crops mainly for feeding people and animals, and enslaved Africans were not used on those farms. Unlike the Southern economy, which relied on agriculture, the Northern economy was focused more on industry and manufacturing. That meant that workers were paid to make things in factories, often using machines. Many northern cities were trading centers for iron, coal, and wood. Northern cities had factories for turning iron into steel, a strong metal that would then be sent to other factories to make trains, engines, buildings, bridges, tools, weapons, and all sorts of other things. Northern cities also had factories for making bottles and jars, furniture, clothing, books, and much more. The factories in the North had access to railroads and shipping ports to distribute the goods that were made there. Because the South wasn't producing a lot of these things in their region, they couldn't buy these goods from the North. People as far away from as Great Britain could buy steel from northern factories, helping the northern economy. Factories were an important part of the northern economy. Thousands and thousands of people worked in the northern factories. These factory workers were not slaves. They were paid for their hard work. That was true that factory bosses could be harsh. The pay was often pitiful, and the work was difficult, dangerous, and trying. But, however, factory workers did have more freedom than slaves. They had the possibility of a better life. Even though slavery became illegal or against the law in the North before it became illegal in the South, not everyone in the North was against slavery. Because slavery was not a part of their everyday life, some people in the North didn't really think much about it. A small group of people in the North, however, absolutely were against slavery, no matter what it did for the economy. These people saw slavery as evil. They thought people from Africa should be treated as free human beings. These people saw slavery as the cruel and hateful practice that it was. People who worked to abolish or end slavery became known as abolitionists. This group of abolitionists continued to grow larger and larger over time. By mid-1800s, there were thousands of abolitionists. Some became famous, like Frederick Douglass, who had been an enslaved African who escaped, Wendell Phillips, and Susan B. Anthony. These are the pictures here, but they were just a few of 1,000 people involved in the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement refers to organized activities or events to end slavery. Harriet Tubman was also another famous abolitionist, in addition to being a famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She not only helped enslaved Africans escape, she also went around talking to people in the North, telling them why it is important to abolish slavery and explaining that they could help enslaved Africans. This image shows abolitionists working on the Underground Railroad. Abolitionists helped to keep the Underground Railroad working smoothly, making sure that as many people as possible were able to escape slavery. Harriet Tubman met and worked alongside many famous abolitionists. They printed newspapers like The Liberator and pressured and convinced political leaders like Abraham Lincoln to see why slavery was wrong. The abolitionist movement became a strong force in America, one that could not be ignored. Abolitionists and enslaved Africans worked together in their ways to rebel against plantation owners and to bring an end to slavery. While many enslaved people were being helped to freedom along the Underground Railroad, others were trying to rebel or fight back against the plantation owners in the South. One such event took place in Virginia in an area that is known as Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. In that event, an abolitionist named John Brown tried to get guns and other weapons to slaves to help them rebel against the plantation owners. In another event, the slave named Nat Turner led a group of slaves to rebel against the plantation owners in Virginia. The South Carolina Another formerly enslaved African named Denmark Vesey helped to plan a large rebellion against plantation owners in Charleston. Denmark Vesey's plan was discovered before it could be carried out. However, there were also many small acts of rebellion by enslaved Africans against those who enslaved them. Even in these years leading up to the Civil War, there were many violent events in which many people lost their lives in the struggle to end slavery. The United States was growing and spreading west, adding new states. As the country expanded west, so did the Mason-Dixon line. By the 1850s, the states north of the Mason-Dixon line were free states. In other words, slavery was against the law. In the states south of the Mason-Dixon line, slavery continued to be legal, and there were more territories to the west that soon would be joining the country. The more the country grew, the more reasons people found to argue over the problem of slavery. Abolitionists fought to end slavery. They also wanted to make sure that the new territories and new states did not allow slavery. Others, though, did not agree with the abolitionists and felt the new states should be able to decide for themselves whether or not slavery should be legal. By the 1850s, it was clear that the problem of what to do about slavery, whether to end it or allow it to continue and to spread, was tearing the country apart.